So, I want to tell you a story today about the time a literal tidal wave of molasses killed 21 people. And right off the bat, I know exactly what you were doing.
Yeah, no, it sounds too.
Right. I know how that sounds because when I say the Great Molasses Flood, the very first thing almost everyone does is smile.
It's true. They do.
It sounds like a joke, it sounds like a gag pulled straight out of a Sunday morning cartoon, where people are like comically wading knee deep through this giant puddle of pancake syrup, licking their fingers and laughing.
Right, because the human brain really struggles to associate a baking ingredient with mass casualty devastation.
Exactly. But I want to ask you to do something for me today. I want you to hold on to that smile for just a moment. Just notice it. Feel it. Because, well, you are going to need to remember that you had it.
Because it's about to vanish. The reality of what happened in Boston on that day is anything but a joke.
Not even close to a joke. We are doing a deep dive today into January 15th, 1919. We are looking at a crowded, densely packed, really working-class immigrant neighborhood that was crammed right along the waterfront in Boston's North End.
Yeah, a really vibrant, busy place.
And we're going to use historical accounts plus the unbelievably detailed, thousands of pages of notes from the trial auditor who investigated the aftermath.
The documentation is just staggering.
It is, and we'll combine that with modern engineering analyses, including this massive 2016 Harvard study on fluid dynamics, to essentially deconstruct a nightmare. We are going to look at the actual mechanics of the disaster, the just staggering corporate negligence that built the bomb, and the aftermath that followed.
Because the goal here is to completely dismantle that cartoon version of the story.
Right.
What actually happened is a profound and honestly deeply unsettling historical pivot point. It is a story about a corporation that constructed a lethal structure as cheaply as humanly possible.
Yeah. Literally cutting every corner.
Exactly. And a marginalized community that was forced to pay the ultimate price for that ledger. Plus, the landmark courtroom reckoning that followed.
And perhaps most importantly for you, listening right now, it is the story of the rules that govern your everyday life. The legal battle that followed this disaster literally wrote the safety regulations for the building you are sitting in right now.
It's incredible to think about. The architectural and engineering landscape of the entire modern world was forged in the wreckage of this specific event.
But okay, to understand how a tidal wave of syrup could physically level a city block and rewrite American construction law, we really have to start by answering a very glaring logistical question.
Which is, why on earth were 2.5 million gallons of molasses sitting in a giant, fragile metal tower directly over a crowded Boston neighborhood in the first place?
Right, because nobody accidentally accumulates 2.5 million gallons of molasses. That is an industrial volume. You do not buy that in glass jars at the corner store.
Definitely not. It requires immense purpose-built infrastructure. And it basically comes down to two major historical forces slamming into each other at exactly the same time.
Yeah.
World War I and the looming shadow of Prohibition.
So let's unpack that, because when we encounter molasses in our daily lives now, it's almost exclusively culinary.
Yeah, gingerbread, baked beans, barbecue sauce.
Exactly. But in the 1910s, molasses was this heavily demanded, highly lucrative industrial raw material. It was the absolute lifeblood of the munitions industry.
Right, because it was the primary ingredient used to distill industrial alcohol.
I actually want to pause here and dig into that specific mechanism because I think a lot of people just completely miss the connection between molasses and artillery shells. Like, how does a sticky syrup become a weapon of war?
Well, it is all about the chemistry of fermentation and distillation. You see, molasses is the thick, dark byproduct of refining sugarcane into actual sugar. So it is incredibly rich in fermentable sugars. If you introduce yeast to molasses and water, the yeast consumes the sugar and produces ethanol, which is alcohol. In an industrial distillation plant, you can boil off that alcohol, capture the vapor, and condense it into highly concentrated, pure industrial ethanol.
And the military needs ethanol for explosives.
Massive, unimaginably huge quantities of it. During World War I, the United States and its allies were manufacturing a type of smokeless powder called cordite.
Okay, cordite.
Right, cordite was used as the propellant in artillery shells and bullets. But to manufacture cordite, you need a solvent to mix the chemical components, which are usually gun cotton and nitroglycerin, into this gelatinous paste. that can be shaped and dried.
That's basically the glue that lets you make the explosive.
Exactly. And that solvent was a mixture of ether and alcohol.
Right.
So without the alcohol, you don't get the solvent. Without the solvent, you don't get the smokeless powder. And without the powder, your guns simply don't fire.
Wow. So the entire war machine of the Allied forces is fundamentally running on the back of sugarcane byproducts.
It really was.
And the company that built this tank in Boston, U.S. Industrial Alcohol, or USIA, they were essentially a defense contractor. They were rushing to meet this astronomical wartime demand.
Rushing being the operative word. They were importing molasses from the Caribbean, pumping it into this massive holding tank in Boston, and then immediately loading it onto train cars to be shipped to their distillation plant over in Cambridge.
Just churning out profits at a staggering rate.
Absolutely. But World War I ended in November 1918, so you would naturally think the demand would plummet, right?
Right. War's over. Stop making explosives.
But another massive historical event was bearing down on the industry at that exact moment. The 18th Amendment. Prohibition.
Ah, right. The ban on the sale and manufacture of intoxicating liquors.
The writing was totally on the wall. Distillers knew the country was going dry, and they knew a ban was coming very, very soon. So there was this absolutely frantic, desperate rush to take all that distillation infrastructure they had been using for munitions and pivot.
To make booze.
Exactly. To produce as much consumer rum and grain alcohol as legally possible before the clock ran out. They wanted to stockpile oceans of liquor to sell legally right up until the ban, and frankly, to supply the black market afterward.
So you have a massive corporation that was motivated first by the unlimited budget of a global war, pivoting seamlessly into the massive profits of beating a legislative clock. I mean, they are in a gold rush.
And people digging for gold do not take their time.
No, they do not. They cut corners. Which brings us to the man they put in charge of building this tank in 1915, a guy named Arthur Gell.
Right. So USIA decides they desperately need a new holding tank in Boston to handle the sheer volume of molasses coming in from the ships. They lease a piece of land on Commercial Street in the North End.
Which is right near the water.
Right on the harbor. They need a structure 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter. It has to hold upwards of 26 million pounds of liquid. And they hand the project management over to Arthur Gell.
Now, I want to be very, very clear about who Arthur Gell was, and more importantly, who he wasn't. Because this is really the foundational sin of the entire story. He was not a structural engineer.
No, not at all.
He was not an architect who specialized in industrial storage. He was not a metallurgist. Arthur Gell was the company's treasurer.
He was the man who managed the ledgers. His entire professional focus was minimizing cost and maximizing margin.
Having the treasurer design a 26 million pound liquid holding tank is it's like asking a grocery store manager to design a hydroelectric dam simply because they know the retail price of bottled water.
That is a very accurate comparison. Gell looked at a 50-foot tower of molasses as a line item on a spreadsheet. He completely failed to account for the dynamic, living, honestly terrifying physics of thousands of tons of heavy fluid.
Because he lacked any engineering background, he just lacked a foundational respect for the physical forces at play.
Right. He wasn't constrained by an understanding of metal fatigue or fluid dynamics. He was constrained by a budget and a deadline. He just ordered the steel plates from a manufacturer, hired a local contractor to throw them together, and rushed the entire process.
And he skipped the most basic, fundamental safety protocol in the entire tank building industry.
He really did. When you construct a massive storage tank for hazardous or heavy liquids, the absolute standard operating procedure, even back in 1915, is to fill it with water before you ever introduce the actual product.
Okay, so you fill it with water to test the structural integrity.
Exactly. You observe how the metal handles the immense hydrostatic pressure. You check the rivets. You look for leaks. Water is cheap, it's non-toxic, and if the tank fails the test and ruptures, well, you just have a really big puddle of water draining into the harbor.
But testing a 90-foot wide tank takes time. And it takes money to pump the water all the way in and drain it all the way out. And Arthur Gell didn't want to spend either.
The molasses shipments from Cuba were already en route. The ships were practically pulling into the harbor. So Gell just bypassed the water test completely.
Oh my God.
The very first liquid that ever went into that brand new, totally untested steel structure was thousands of tons of dense, heavy molasses.
Here is where the historical record gets genuinely infuriating. The tank did not fail in silence.
No, it did not.
This wasn't a sudden, out-of-the-blue catastrophe where everyone was shocked. From the moment it was first filled in 1915, the warnings were immediate, loud, and incredibly visible. According to the trial sources, the tank groaned.
Yeah, the metal was audibly screaming under the stress of the liquid.
The physical evidence of structural failure was apparent to anyone just walking down Commercial Street. The steel plates were literally bowing outward.
And the seams between the plates, where the rivets were supposedly holding them together, were not holding. It leaked profusely.
The leaking was so bad that this bizarre microeconomy sprang up in the neighborhood.
Yeah, this part is always wild to me.
I know, right? The residents of the North End, the kids, the local families, would literally walk down to the waterfront with buckets and cups to collect the free molasses dripping down the sides of this 50-foot tower.
It became a daily routine. If you needed sweetener for your kitchen, you just walked down to the giant groaning metal cylinder and scooped up the seepage, because it was literally bleeding from dozens of fissures.
And this is where we have to examine the corporate psychology at play. When a massive industrial container is audibly groaning and visibly leaking a thick substance, the safe, logical response is to empty the tank immediately, bring in inspectors, and reinforce the structural weaknesses.
Obviously.
Yeah.
But emptying the tank means pausing the gold rush. It means halting the trains to the Cambridge distillation plant.
Right. It means stopping the money.
Exactly. So what does USI do? What is the company's brilliant, cost-effective solution to a failing, leaking metal bomb suspended over a neighborhood?
It's almost hard to say out loud. They painted it brown.
They ordered crews to paint the entire exterior of the steel tank a dark, reddish-brown color that exactly matched the shade of the molasses.
It's unbelievable.
They didn't fix the structural failure at all. They just optically camouflaged the seepage so that the neighborhood and any passing city inspectors couldn't see the streaks of leaked syrup as easily.
It is a breathtaking level of negligence. I mean, you are an executive. You know the tank holds over 2 million gallons of incredibly dense liquid. One of the trial accounts notes that a USIA employee actually went out, collected physical chunks of the failing steel that had flaked off the overstressed tank, brought them into the executive offices, and essentially dropped them on the desk.
Yes. They provided physical evidence that the metal was shearing.
And the documented response from the USIA executives to seeing those chunks of distressed metal was fundamentally, well, the tank is still standing.
It's a classic case of getting away with something dangerous for so long that you convince yourself it's actually safe. They looked at a bomb that was ticking visibly, loudly ticking, and they decided to just paint over the timer so they wouldn't have to look at the numbers counting down.
That is the perfect way to describe it. It is the ultimate manifestation of the sunk cost fallacy combined with a total lack of regulatory oversight. They had built it, it was holding the molasses for the time being, and they convinced themselves that because a catastrophic failure hadn't happened yet, it simply never would.
But physics does not care about corporate denial. The executives could ignore the groaning metal all they wanted, but the laws of thermodynamics and hydrostatic pressure were quietly doing the math.
And the math finalized on a Wednesday, January 15th, 1919. So let's talk about that cold open. Let's look at the actual physics of what happened, because this is where the cartoon image of the slow-moving syrup entirely falls apart.
Setting the scene here is vital to understand the scale of the destruction. It is around 12:30 p.m. The North End is bustling. You have laborers down at the docks loading freight onto horse-drawn wagons.
Normal busy day.
Right. You have children out in the streets on their lunch break. Some of them are scavenging for firewood near the harbor. The local firehouse, Engine 31, is right next to the tank. The firefighters are inside eating lunch, playing cards. It is an unusually warm winter day. Temperatures had spiked into the 40s Fahrenheit.
And then at 12:40 p.m., the metal finally gives way. But it doesn't just split open and ooze.
No, not at all.
The witnesses who survived the initial rupture reported hearing what sounded like heavy machine gun fire, a rapid, deafening tat-tat-tat-tat.
And that sound was the immense pressure inside the tank finally overcoming the sheer strength of the steel rivets. A rivet is a metal pin holding two plates of steel together. When the stress became too great, those rivets didn't just bend. They violently sheared off and shot out of the metal plates like artillery shrapnel, hundreds of them firing in rapid succession. That was the machine gun sound.
Once the rivets failed, the structural integrity of the steel plates just vanished. The 50-foot tank essentially unzipped itself from the bottom up in a fraction of a second. The steel walls tore apart, and 2.5 million gallons of molasses were unleashed all at once.
To really understand the destruction that followed, we have to look closely at the fluid dynamics, relying heavily on that 2016 Harvard study you mentioned earlier.
Right.
Because when we hear the word flood, we immediately visualize water. We picture a river overflowing its banks or a dam breaking.
Wait, I'm struggling with the physics here. If I fill a water balloon too much, it pops and splashes. If a water tower breaks, it creates a massive localized puddle that just flows downhill. How does a liquid bursting from a tank generate enough concussive force to snap a firehouse off its foundation? Liquids don't act like explosives.
Well, they do when you factor in density, volume, and what physicists call a gravity current. Molasses is not water. Depending on its exact composition, molasses is roughly 40 to 50% denser than water. A gallon of water weighs about 8.3 pounds. A gallon of molasses can weigh nearly 12 pounds.
So it's much heavier.
Much heavier. We are talking about 26 million pounds of fluid suddenly entirely unsupported by walls.
So it's essentially a solid mass in free fall.
Exactly. When that tank ruptured, that immense weight collapsed downward under gravity. But because liquids can't compress, all that downward force had to transfer outward horizontally. This creates a gravity current.
A gravity current?
Right, a dense fluid rapidly spreading horizontally into a less dense fluid, which in this case is the surrounding air. The leading edge of that wave moves with terrifying velocity.
Okay, if you are listening to this and picturing getting knocked over by a sticky wave at a water park, you need to entirely erase that image from your mind. Do not think of a wave pool. Think of a 15 to 40-foot moving wall of wet, uncured concrete. And it is hitting the neighborhood at 35 miles per hour.
The kinetic energy of a fluid that dense, moving at 35 miles per hour, is catastrophic. The initial wave was approximately 160 feet wide. When it hit the surrounding structures, it did not flow around them like water would. It absolutely obliterated them.
The damage reports from the trial read like the aftermath of an F5 tornado. The wave hit the Engine 31 firehouse and literally snapped the multi-story brick building off its foundation, sweeping it down the street.
It hit the supports of the Boston Elevated Railway, these massive steel girders holding up the train tracks, and sheared the steel completely off its concrete footings.
It picked up human beings, horses, and heavy freight wagons and just hurled them through the air. The victims were not simply drowning in a sticky liquid. They were experiencing massive blunt force trauma.
Right, because the wave was carrying thousands of pounds of debris. It picked up rail cars, it picked up iron lamp posts and sections of the shattered steel tank itself. It carried them forward at high speed, turning them into massive battering rams.
The sheer destructive kinetic energy is staggering. But as horrifying as that initial impact was, the modern research that 2016 Harvard study on the fluid dynamics revealed what I consider the absolute nightmare scenario of this disaster. They identified what we might call the cooling trap.
This is where the physical properties of molasses become deeply cruel.
Yeah.
You have to ask, what was the temperature of the molasses inside the tank right before it burst?
It was warm. The sources show that USIA had received a massive new shipment of molasses from a ship called the Miliero just a couple of days prior. Because molasses is thick, the only way to quickly pump it from the ship's hold into the 50-foot tank is to heat it up.
Exactly.
So they piped steam into the ship's hold, warmed the molasses so it would flow easily, and pumped it into the tank. So inside the cylinder, you have this massive volume of warm, relatively fluid syrup.
But outside the tank, it is January in New England. Yes, it was an unusually mild day in the 40s, but that ambient air temperature is still significantly colder than the heated molasses.
So when the tank ruptures, this warm, flowing mass explodes outward, traveling at 35 miles an hour. But as it spreads out over the streets, maximizing its surface area exposed to the winter air, it rapidly begins to cool.
And this is the critical fluid dynamic mechanism. Molasses is highly temperature dependent. Its viscosity, its thickness, and resistance to flow increases exponentially as its temperature drops.
So it went from flowing like heavy water to setting like cement.
Yes, the initial wave hit with the kinetic energy of wet concrete, crushing buildings and sweeping people up. But within minutes, as the wave lost its forward momentum and the winter air sapped the heat from the liquid, the viscosity skyrocketed. It turned into an incredibly thick, heavy, unyielding mass.
It's the ultimate cruelty of the disaster. You survived the initial impact, you didn't get crushed by the flying debris, but now you are trapped in the wreckage, covered head to toe in a dense, heavy syrup. And as you struggle to move your arms, to breathe, the syrup is literally hardening around you.
The rescue efforts were a waking nightmare. Police officers, sailors from naval ships docked nearby, and surviving citizens all rushed into the blast zone. But they had to wade waist deep into this cooling trap.
I honestly can't imagine the physical exertion required just to move your legs through cooling, thickening molasses.
The sources describe rescuers becoming completely exhausted within minutes. They were fighting a material that was actively setting like glue, effectively cementing the entire neighborhood in place.
They were trying to pull survivors out of the muck before they suffocated, but the suction of the heavy liquid held them fast.
In many cases, they couldn't even tell what was debris and what was a person. Everything was coated in the exact same dark brown sludge. They had to frantically wipe the faces of victims just to clear their airways so they could breathe, all while standing in a freezing, hardening swamp of industrial sugar.
The final immediate human cost of this corporate decision was profound. 21 people dead, roughly 150 people severely injured with broken bones, crushed ribs, and traumatic head injuries.
Entire families were destroyed.
The men inside the Engine 31 firehouse, who had just been playing cards moments before, were trapped inside the collapsed ruins of their own station. It was a scene of unimaginable devastation brought on entirely because a treasurer wanted to save a few bucks on steel testing.
And as the immediate horror of the wave subsided, it left behind a neighborhood that looked like a lunar landscape painted brown. The physical cleanup of this disaster was unlike anything a modern city had ever faced. But while the residents began the agonizing process of trying to dig their lives out from under millions of gallons of syrup, the company responsible, USIA, was already mobilizing.
Right.
They immediately began a massive campaign to wash their hands of the blame.
Let's talk about the physical lingering of this event first, because it's something out of a dark, surreal folklore. The historical sources detail the cleanup effort, and it sounds almost mythological in its scale.
It really does.
The city deployed hundreds of workers to the north end. They couldn't use fresh water from the fire hydrants because it didn't do anything to the hardened molasses. They had to bring in massive saltwater pumps, pulling water directly from Boston Harbor just to try and dissolve the syrup on the streets.
And this was not a quick process. The cleanup took months. The sheer volume of the molasses meant that it had seeped into every cobblestone, flowed into the basements of every standing structure, and coated the foundations of the buildings.
The harbor itself ran brown well into the summer of 1919. That is how much syrup was washed off the streets and into the water. And the local accounts are just wild to read.
Oh, definitely.
For weeks, they said, the entire north end was sticky. Everything you touched, the doorknobs of the buildings that survived, the public telephones, the literal soles of your shoes as you walked down the street. It would track onto the streetcars and spread to other parts of the city. The disaster lingered physically longer than almost any other industrial accident you can think of.
It was a constant, inescapable, sticky reminder of what had happened. But to fully understand the next phase of this story, the corporate response and the massive legal battle that followed, we have to provide some critical context about the demographics of the victims.
Right, because disasters do not happen in a vacuum. We need to look closely at who this happened to.
It's exactly. Who gets put in danger and whose complaints get ignored is almost always a question of leverage. The north end of Boston in 1919 was a very specifically defined demographic area. It was a densely packed, working-class district, and it was primarily home to poor, often non-citizen Italian immigrants.
This explains everything about why the tank was located there in the first place. This was a marginalized community. They did not have political power. They did not have high-priced lawyers on retainer. They didn't have the ear of the mayor. And they certainly didn't sit on the boards of city zoning committees.
Which is exactly why a massive, dangerous, completely untested industrial structure was dumped directly onto their doorstep. You do not see untested, groaning, leaking molasses tanks built in wealthy, politically connected neighborhoods like Beacon Hill. USIA built it in the North End because they assumed the residents lacked the agency to stop them.
And it is exactly why their complaints about the leaks were ignored. Remember the community collecting the molasses? Remember the sheer volume of the groaning metal?
They knew it was a hazard.
The people living there absolutely knew it was a hazard. But when a poor immigrant complains to a massive defense contractor, the corporation just paints the tank brown. They assume they will never be held accountable by these specific people.
And that assumption of powerlessness is precisely what drove the company's legal strategy in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. Because as the bodies were being recovered from the hardened sludge and the property damage was being tallied, USIA was suddenly facing an avalanche of litigation.
A literal avalanche.
119 massive lawsuits were filed against the company by the survivors, local business owners, and the families of the victims.
119 lawsuits. So what does a giant corporation do when their giant, illegally untested tank bursts and kills 21 people? Do they admit fault? Do they open their checkbooks to provide a restitution to the widows and orphans?
Absolutely not. They refused to admit any fault whatsoever. Instead, they concocted a defense strategy that was as audacious as it was cynical. They blamed anarchists.
Hang on, I need to make sure I'm hearing this right. They claimed the tank exploding was an act of terrorism.
Yes. USIA's official primary legal defense was that their perfectly constructed, totally safe tank had been deliberately targeted and blown up by a bomb planted by political anarchists.
I am going to ask you, listening to this right now, to just sit with the scale of that lie. A corporation hires their own accountant to build a massive tank in a vulnerable neighborhood. They refuse to test it with water to save money. The thing leaks so badly they have to camouflage it with brown paint.
And an employee literally hands the executives pieces of flaking steel.
Right. And then the structure violently ruptures, kills 21 innocent people, and the executives point at the wreckage and say, the terrorists did it.
It is stunning. But to understand why they thought this specific lie would work in a court of law, we have to look at the historical context of the era. The year was 1919. This was the absolute height of the first Red Scare in the United States. Anarchist bombings were not just a theoretical boogeyman. They were a very real, terrifying news story dominating the headlines across the country.
Right, this is the era of the Galleanists, the radical anarchist followers of Luigi Galleani, who were actively carrying out bombing campaigns against judges, politicians, and law enforcement.
Exactly. There had been a series of highly publicized mail bombings and violent labor strikes. The American public was incredibly on edge. They were terrified of hidden bombs and political radicals.
So USIA weaponized the headlines. They
Yeah.
saw what terrified the average American judge and jury, and they decided to use that fear to deflect from their own blatant greed. They essentially said, don't look at our thin steel or our lack of an engineering license. Look at the scary radicals hiding in the shadows.
It was a calculated attempt to use xenophobia and political paranoia to shield their bottom line. And the deeply insidious part of this strategy is how it targeted the victims.
Oh, this part is just infuriating.
They argued that because the North End was a predominantly Italian immigrant neighborhood, it must be a hotbed of Italian anarchist activity. Therefore, someone in the neighborhood must have been disgruntled with the defense contractor and blown up the tank from the outside.
It is victim blaming on an industrial scale. They dump a lethal hazard in an immigrant neighborhood because they believe the residents are politically powerless. And then when the hazard kills them, they use the residents' ethnic background as proof that they must have blown it up themselves. It is staggering.
USIA fully expected this strategy to work. They had unlimited legal funds. They expected the poor immigrant neighborhood to eventually fold under the immense financial weight of a prolonged legal battle combined with the national fears of anarchism. They thought they could just drown the plaintiffs in paperwork, drag it out in court until the victims ran out of money and gave up.
But they didn't.
No.
The neighborhood did not fold. Instead, they dug in for the absolute fight of their lives. Which brings us to the legal leviathan that this case became.
It truly was a leviathan. As we mentioned, there were 119 separate lawsuits filed. To make the proceedings even remotely manageable, the Massachusetts Superior Court rolled all 119 of those suits into one massive consolidated proceeding.
Which is pretty rare, right?
Very rare for the time. And what followed was one of the longest, most exhausting, and costliest civil cases in the history of Massachusetts up to that point.
We are talking about a legal marathon that spanned nearly 5 entire years. 5 years of daily hearings, of endless motions, of working-class people having to take time off work to fight for every inch of ground against a massive, well-funded corporate legal team.
The sheer scale of the evidence presented during those 5 years is hard to comprehend. Around 1,000 individual witnesses were called to testify.
Let's just picture what that testimony looked like. You have hundreds of survivors taking the stand to recount the trauma of the wave. You have the rescuers detailing the sheer physical impossibility of the cooling trap. And crucially, you have the neighborhood residents testifying about the years of audible groaning.
Witness after witness taking the stand saying, I collected the molasses in a cup. I saw them paint it brown.
Right. Alongside the human testimony, there were roughly 1,500 separate physical exhibits presented to the court. But what makes this trial so historically significant, what truly broke the case wide open and destroyed USIA's anarchist defense, was the introduction of rigorous scientific expert testimony.
Because this wasn't just going to be a battle of he said, she said. The lawyers representing the victims realized they couldn't just rely on emotional testimony to beat a massive corporation. They needed hard science. So they brought in early forensic engineers. They brought in metallurgists.
They took the shattered, twisted steel plates of the ruptured tank, brought them into the courtroom, and subjected them to rigorous scientific testing. They systematically dismantled the company's bomb theory.
Exactly.
But how do you definitively prove to a judge in 1925 that a metal tank wasn't blown up by dynamite?
You look at the physics of the blast and the state of the metal. The engineers testified that if a bomb had been planted outside the tank, the metal plates would be bent inward from the external concussive force. But all the evidence showed the metal was bent violently outward, indicating a massive internal failure.
Oh, wow, that makes perfect sense.
Furthermore, they used microscopic analysis to examine the rivet holes and the tears in the steel. They found zero residue of explosives. What they did find was profound structural fatigue.
They proved what the neighborhood had known all along. The tank was just badly built. And the modern science we have today has only further vindicated those 1920s engineers. Fast forward to 2014, a modern structural engineer named Ronald Mayville conducted a comprehensive analysis of the historical data and the steel specifications from the trial.
And Mayville's analysis proved exactly how deeply negligent Arthur Gell actually was when he ordered the materials. Mayville calculated the necessary hoop stress requirements for a tank of that size. He concluded that the steel walls of the tank were only about half as thick as they should have been to safely hold that volume of dense liquid.
And I want to be clear here, that is not half as thick by today's hyper-strict standards. Mayville proved the steel was half as thick as it should have been, even by the much more lenient Wild West engineering standards of 1915. Arthur Gell was drastically cutting corners. He essentially built a paper-thin metal balloon and filled it with 26 million pounds of wet concrete equivalent syrup.
The modern studies also clarify the exact mechanism of the rupture. We talked about the internal pressure, but why did it fail on that specific day? It was a deadly combination of forces. First, you have the incredibly poor quality of early 20th century steel. The steel used had a high sulfur content, which makes metal highly brittle at lower temperatures.
Okay, so poor material.
Second, you have thermal expansion from the fluctuating January weather. Warm days, freezing nights, causing the thin steel to constantly expand and contract, weakening the rivet holes over 4 years.
It's metal fatigue. The tank was effectively breathing in and out every day.
Exactly. And third, you have fermentation pressure. Remember, molasses is full of sugar. On unusually warm days, the yeast naturally present in the unrefined molasses would become active. It would eat the sugar and release massive amounts of carbon dioxide. Because the tank was sealed and poorly vented, that gas had nowhere to go. It essentially turned the massive steel tank into a shaken soda bottle.
So you have a paper-thin, highly brittle, expanding and contracting steel bottle filled with thousands of tons of heavy liquid, actively generating pressurized gas inside. It was a mathematical certainty that it would explode.
And this mountain of scientific evidence was presented to the court-appointed auditor, a man named Hugh Ogden. For years, Ogden listened to the 1,000 witnesses. He reviewed the 1,500 exhibits. He analyzed the engineering reports on metal fatigue and hydrostatic pressure. And in 1925, he issued his verdict.
And the verdict is a complete, unequivocal rejection of U.S. industrial alcohol's narrative. Ogden flatly denied the anarchist bomb story. He found USIA entirely and solely responsible for the disaster.
He didn't mince words in his ruling either. His findings stated definitively that the tank was simply too thin, too weak, and entirely too poorly designed to hold the massive volume of liquid it was asked to hold. He laid the blame squarely on the shoddy construction, the total lack of safety testing, and the blatant negligence of Arthur Gell and the corporate executives who allowed a treasurer to play architect.
As a result of the ruling, the company was forced to pay out a settlement of roughly $628,000 to the victors and their families. If we adjust for inflation, that equates to several $1,000,000 today. Now, obviously, no amount of money brings back the 21 lives lost. But as a legal outcome, this is a massive David and Goliath victory. You have a marginalized community of working-class immigrants who stood toe-to-toe with an industrial defense contractor for half a decade. They fought through a cynical smear campaign, and they won. They forced the giant to admit that their greed caused the deaths of their loved ones.
It was a monumental, precedent-setting victory. But what does this all mean for us? Why are we doing a deep dive on a burst syrup tank over 100 years later?
This is where we get to the real stakes of the story. because the most important outcome of this disaster was not the financial payout. The true legacy of the Great Molasses Flood is how those 21 lost lives permanently and fundamentally changed the world that you and I live in today.
The victims won the lawsuit, but they also ushered in a completely new era of building safety. Because before 1919, the regulatory environment for construction in the United States was incredibly lax. It was essentially the Wild West. If you owned the land and you had the money to buy the materials, you could pretty much build whatever you wanted, however you wanted.
The roles of architect, engineer, and builder were often blurred together. You could literally have your corporate accountant sketch a 50-foot liquid storage tank on a piece of paper, hand it to a steelworker, and build it next to a firehouse.
But the audacity of USIA's negligence and the undeniable, highly publicized horror of the consequences became a watershed moment for corporate accountability in construction law. The sheer public outrage, fueled by the staggering details revealed during the Marathon trial, the brown paint, the lack of a water test, the sheer incompetence of Arthur Gell forced lawmakers to act.
The laws changed. And they changed specifically because an unqualified money manager built a bomb.
The direct legacy of this disaster is the modern system of professional licensing and municipal inspection. Following the Molasses flood and the subsequent trial, new laws and ordinances were passed across Massachusetts, which quickly became the blueprint for the rest of the country. These laws required that all major construction projects be designed, heavily inspected, and crucially, signed off on by registered, licensed professionals.
This is the birth of the PE, the professional engineer stamp. You could no longer just pour concrete or erect steel because you felt like it. You had to have a registered engineer, someone who had passed rigorous state board exams proving they understood metal fatigue and fluid dynamics, stamp the blueprints.
You had to have a licensed architect verify the structural integrity. You had to prove to the city through a permit process that your building wasn't going to collapse on the people walking below it.
This disaster established the legal precedent that building safety is a matter of profound public concern, not just private enterprise. It enshrined the idea that the state has a fundamental duty to protect its citizens from negligent corporate construction.
That is exactly right.
I want you to do something right now. Just look up at the ceiling of the room you're sitting in. Think about the bridge you might have driven over on your way to work today. Think about the high-rise office building you might work in. The rules that quietly and visibly keep those structures from collapsing onto you. The building codes, the mandatory inspections, the required engineering steps. Those rules trace their lineage directly back to this flood.
It's an unbroken line.
They trace back to that courtroom in Boston and the exhausting 5-year fight put up by a marginalized neighborhood.
It is a profound realization. The safety infrastructure of the modern built environment is largely reactive. It is built on the lessons learned from catastrophic failures. And this was one of the most pivotal, undeniable failures in American history.
Which makes the physical reality of the site today incredibly sobering. Because despite changing American infrastructure forever, despite writing the building codes that protect millions of lives every single day, there is almost no physical footprint of this event left in Boston.
That's right. If you travel to the North End today, and you walk down to the waterfront park near Commercial Street where the tank stood, you will not find a massive monument. You will not find a museum dedicated to the trial, the fluid dynamics, or the engineering changes that saved countless subsequent lives.
You will find exactly one thing: a single small green plaque at the entrance to a recreational park. That's it. A modest metal sign that briefly explains the disaster and bears the names of the 21 people who died. 21 names marking the spot where a tidal wave of syrup wiped a neighborhood off the map.
It is a remarkably quiet memorial for an event that echoed so loudly through the legal and architectural systems of the country.
And I think that brings us back to where we started. It brings us back to that smile. The tragedy of the Great Molasses Flood is that it survives in our collective memory primarily as a punchline. It is a quirky piece of trivia to pull out at a bar, but the sheer silliness of the premise, a flood of baking syrup, is just camouflage. It is camouflage for the oldest, darkest story we know.
It is the story of a preventable death, built on the cheap by people who prioritize speed over safety. It is the story of a powerless community forced to pay the toll for a corporation's greed. And it is the story of a hard-won safety rule written in the blood of those 21 victims, so that the rest of us never have to learn the lesson the hard way again.
The punchline is a disguise. And once you strip that disguise away, you are left with a staggering story of hubris, destruction, and ultimately a demand for accountability that changed the world.
Which leaves us with an important question to consider moving forward.
Yeah.
If we connect the specific history of Arthur Gell and the USIA to the broader picture of corporate behavior today, we have to look at the concept of painting the tank brown.
Right.
We know now definitively that 21 people died because a company chose to use paint to hide a structural failure rather than spend the money to fix the underlying problem. They chose aesthetics over safety. They chose the illusion of stability over the reality of a crisis.
And that is the final thought I want to leave you with today. Because corporate nature hasn't fundamentally changed since 1919. The drive to maximize profit while minimizing expenditure is still the dominant force in industry. So as you move through your modern, highly regulated world, a world built on the lessons of this exact disaster, ask yourself, where is this still happening?
Yeah, that's the real question.
In what industries today, right now, are we still just painting over the leaks? Where are we ignoring the groaning metal, prioritizing the quarterly profits, and just waiting for the tank to burst?
Because there is always a new tank being built, and the lessons of 1919 demand that we keep a very close eye on the people building them.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And the next time someone brings up the Great Molasses Flood, the next time someone smiles at the quirky imagery of a slow-moving syrup wave, I hope you remember what you learned today. I hope you remember the deafening sound of the rivets shearing. I hope you remember the 5-year fight for justice. But most of all, I hope you remember those 21 names on that small plaque, because they are the reason you are safe right now.